Welcome back to the fourth day of the Quinn Sewalong. Today is really just all about hemming. Now, as I've told you before, I'm sewing up 3 different views: the short, the hip length, and then the mini dress. This is so that I can show you, all of the steps, and, a big part of that is the hemming, as views B, C, and D are hemmed differently than view A. So let's start by just showing you how to hem view A. Now, all of the views come with a hem facing. This is what view A's hem facing looks like. It's more curved, while the hem facing for views B through D is straight, so just make sure you have the correct ones. Okay, so for view A, we are going to line up the center backs of the hem facing. There are notches there, and you can pin it if you want, and then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we're just going to stitch that at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can trim that down if you would like, and then we are going to press those seam allowances open. And then we're not done with pressing here, because we are going to press down the top edge by about 1/4 of an inch. Once again, I just eyeball this, but you can be more precise if you would like. Next, we need to attach the ends of the hem facing to the bottom of the front facing. So with the front facing extended, we are going to match up the hem facing and the front facing at these bottom little angled edges with right sides touching. So those little angles should all match up, and then we are going to stitch at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. It's going to be intersecting with that very bottom angled edge. You can go ahead and pin this if you would like. And then we're going to do that to both sides. Make sure that you're not twisting your hem facing at all when you do this. So it should just be laying flat against the front of your vest when you're attaching it on both sides. Okay, this is what it should look like. You can go ahead and trim down those seam allowances again if you would like, and then we are going to press those seam allowances open. Okay, so now to attach the rest of the hem facing to the bottom of the vest. So fold the entire facing back along that center front seam, and then you're going to line up the bottom angled and the curved edges of the facing with the bottom of the vest. You can line up the center back seams, and then there are notches on the bottom of the hem facing that will match up with the side seams. Okay, once that's all pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine, and we're going to stitch starting there at that center front, down at the angle. Make sure you're pivoting at those corners, and you're going to stitch all the way around, pivoting again at that bottom angle, and then ending at the other center front, back stitching at both ends. And you're doing this once again at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, And this is what it should look like. So the next thing that we need to do is we do need to reduce the bulk at those seams. So first we're going to grade the seams, and what I usually do is I just cut the seam allowance in half for the facing. So that is the seam allowance with the fusible on it. And then you also want to just trim down any of the areas that are at the points or the angles so that those can turn and have really nice points once the facing is turned to the inside. My fabric is not super bulky, so if your fabric is a little bit on the bulkier side, you might want to do a little bit of extra grading, but that's up to you. Okay, and then next we're turning the entire facing, so that's the front facing and then also the hem facing right side out. And then you're gonna press that facing to the inside of the garment. You can use lots of steam, use some point turners so that you can get some really good points at any of those corners. I also like to just cheat that seam a teeny bit to the inside along the hem so that the facing doesn't poke out at all on the right side of your garment. But yeah, just take your time, make sure that you get all those points really nice and that you're evenly pressing up that hem along the bottom edge. And then of course we're going to go ahead and we are going to pin everything that we just pressed up so that we can stitch the hem. Now we are going to stitch on our sewing machine, but if you want, you could also hand stitch this if you wanted a little bit more of a high-end finish. And then we're going to stitch starting and stopping at that center front line along that folded edge, which ends up being about just like a teeny bit less than 1 inch from the bottom of the garment. And then once again, you are going all the way past the hem facing and into the front facing, so ending and back stitching right there at the fronts. So this is what it should look like when it's done. I would go ahead and give this a good press, but essentially if you're sewing up view A, you are done for today, and we'll come back tomorrow and we'll finish with just all the last little details for the short vest. Okay, now for the other views, which actually have the same instructions, but view B does look a little different than view C and D, so I'll just be going back and forth between the two. So go ahead and grab your hem facings. Once again, they are straight. I'm showing you B and C here, but they're actually exactly the same. They're just different fabrics. Now look for the center back notches, because you are going to line up those center back notches, right sides touching, and then you are going to stitch that together at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. And then you can trim down those seam allowances if you would like, and then we are going to press those seam allowances open. Now make sure that you know what the bottom and what the top of your hem facing is. The bottom is going to have the notches along it and the top will not have any notches. Now once you've decided where those notches are, so what the bottom and the top is, then you are going to fold down the top edge by 1/4 inch and press it wrong sides touching. Okay, next we are going to attach the ends of the front facing to the ends of the hem facing. We're going to start here with view B, or the hip length vest. So you're going to extend the front facing out. So this is what it looks like on view B. So the wrong side of the front facing is going to be touching the right side of the hem facing, and you're going to be lining up those notches. So essentially the end of the front face or the hem facing is just getting tucked behind the front facing. So go ahead and pin that. And then I just want to go ahead and show you it once again on the other side because I know it can be a little bit confusing. So we are taking that little bottom notch there at the bottom of the hem facing, and we are tucking it behind the front facing, matching up those notches and pinning. And then we'll go over to our sewing machine, and then we are going to actually just stitch on top of the previous stitch line from when we folded in the inside edge of the front facing. Okay, and this is what it should look like. So once again, you're just on top of that previous top stitching, and that is now attached the hem facing to the underside of the front facing. Okay, now we're going to do the same thing to view C, which is the mini dress. The method is actually the same, but it just looks a teeny bit different because the front facings are a different shape. So go ahead and line up the bottom notches of the front facing and the hem facing. The hem facing is going to be tucked behind the front facing, and then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and stitch on top of that stitch line that we did before as we turned under the inside edge of the front facing. Okay, and this is what it should look like when you're done with that step. I should have said this before, but hopefully you didn't twist your facing at all, as it does need to lay straight along the bottom of your dress. Okay, now you're going to fold the entire facing back along that center front seam. You're going to be lining up the bottom edges of the facing with the main garment. You're going to match up those center back seams, and then there are notches on the bottom of the hem facing that should line up with the side seams. So go ahead and pin that along that entire bottom edge, and then once that's pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch the entire bottom edge at a normal 1/2 inch seam allowance. Okay, and let me show you what that looks like on view B, because it does look a teeny bit different because of the front facing shape. So once again, you are folding back the entire facing back along that center front seam, and you're going to line up those angled edges and then also the hem. And then you're going to give that lots of pins all along that angled front edge and then also the bottom. Once again, the center back seam should match up, and then the notch along the bottom of the hem facing should match up with the side seam. And then we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch down the front angled edge all the way across the bottom and then up along the other front angled edge. Make sure that at each of those corners you're leaving your presser foot down, leaving the needle down, and then you are pivoting so that you get a really nice sharp corner. Okay, and this is how view B should look once that is all sewn up. And then let me also show you what view C is looking like. Now we need to go ahead and trim and grade those seam allowances. So make sure you trim out any of the corners so that you can get sharp angles once it's turned right side out. And then as far as grading goes, what I generally do is I just cut the seam allowance in half for the facing. So that is the seam allowance with the fusible on it. That usually does the trick for me. If you have a thicker fabric, you also might want to grade that a little bit more. Okay, and let's do the same thing for view B. So essentially we are going to, cut any of the corners, any of the angles just to remove that bulk so that it will turn nicely. And then we're going to trim down the seam allowances by trimming the seam allowances of the facing in half. So that is the seam allowance that has the fusible on it. And once again, you can always do more grading than this if you prefer. Okay, I know that things are looking a little bit rough right now, but luckily we're about to make them look much nicer. So we're going to turn the entire facing to the inside of the garment, so hiding all of those ugly seam allowances. Make sure that you are using a point turner or something so that you can get really good points as you're turning that right side out. And as you are pressing and turning this facing, you're also going to start pinning it in place. As far as the hem goes, I do like to slightly cheat that seam line to the inside of the garment, just so that we don't see any of the facing peeking out once you are wearing the garment. And once that is all pressed and pinned, we're going to go over to our sewing machine and we are going to stitch along that inside folded edge from the center front to the other center front, back stitching at both sides. And that will be just at that folded line, which is going to be at a scant 1 inch. Okay, let's do the same thing for view C, so the dress. So once again, we are going to be turning the entire facing to the inside, covering all those ugly seam allowances, using a point turner at all of those corners, and then just using the steam on our iron and pressing the entire facing to the inside of the garment and then pinning it as we go. And then once again, like we talked about before, we are going to stitch from end to end just at that folded line, which is going to be just a little bit less than 1 inch from the bottom of the vest or dress. One other option is you could always hand stitch the hem up if you are looking for a little bit more of a refined look and so that you don't see the hem stitch line on the right side of your garment. So totally up to you. Okay, and here is what it should look like when you're done. Here is view B with the hem all finished. And then let's also look at view C, which would be the same as view D. Okay, and here's one last look at all 3 of the hems that we did today. Tomorrow we're going to come back and we are going to finish this sew along. So we are going to be doing buttons and buttonholes. We are going to be attaching the back slider for the ties, and then hopefully you'll be able to finish and wear your Quinn. Please let me know in the comments if you have any questions that I can answer for you. Thanks so much for following along, and I hope that this was helpful.